She ran barefoot through the burning desert with nothing but a torn cloth and a piece of paper that could destroy the most powerful man in Texas. He was a silent rancher with a wedding ring mark on his finger and a past everyone whispered about. When their paths crossed at his fence line, she looked at him with terror in her eyes and said 5 words that changed everything. Do not look at me like that. What happened next would drag his name through the mud, put her life in danger, and force them both to face the truth they had been running from. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. The woman who could save them both was someone he thought he had lost forever. Now, before we begin, let me tell you why this story matters. This is not just a tale about justice or romance. This is about the price of silence, about what happens when good people stay quiet while bad people get comfortable. If you have ever watched someone powerful hurt someone weaker and wondered why nobody stepped in, you will understand this story in your bones. If you have ever swallowed words you should have spoken because speaking felt too dangerous, Caleb Hart's journey will hit you somewhere deep. The lesson is simple, but it is not easy. You do not have to be perfect to do the right thing. You do not have to be brave every moment. You just have to choose. One time, when it matters most. And sometimes that one choice changes everything. If stories about ordinary people finding courage speak to you, subscribe now and tap that bell so you never miss another tale. Drop a comment below and tell me this. Have you ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken? What would you do differently now? Share this with someone who needs to hear that it is never too late to choose brave. Now settle in. She stumbled out of the heat with nothing but a torn cloth wrapped around her shoulders. Blood had dried on her scraped knees. Terror pushed her forward even when her legs begged to stop. The sun hung straight overhead, burning everything it touched. The ground scorched her bare feet with every step, and she did not know where she was running anymore. Every step hurt. Every breath scraped her throat like sandpaper. But stopping felt worse than dying. She had left everything behind in the dark. Her voice, her name, her safety, and she was certain someone was still coming for her. When she reached the line of fence posts and the wide open land beyond them, her knees finally gave out. She slid down the trunk of a cottonwood tree, shaking, clutching the cloth to her chest, trying to make herself smaller than fear. That was when the horse stopped. That was when the man stared. Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me say them. This story is about a man who learned that silence could save your life on the open range, but destroyed everything else. It is about a woman who ran from one monster and found herself staring at another kind of man entirely. And it is about justice, the slow kind that comes when good people finally decide to stand up. If you have ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken, this story will hit you somewhere deep. If you have ever watched someone powerful get away with cruelty because nobody wanted the trouble, you will understand why this tale matters. Subscribe now if you want to hear how a silent rancher and a runaway woman brought down one of the most respected men in Texas. And stay until the end, because the twist that changes everything comes when you least expect it. Now let me tell you about Caleb Hart. Caleb did not move at first because he always looked before he acted. At 49 years old, he had learned that rushing got men killed. Silence kept them alive. He sat tall in the saddle, dust on his boots, eyes sharp, jaw tight. He studied the scene in front of him the way he studied everything. Careful, measured, like he was solving a problem nobody had asked him to solve. His jaw worked like he was chewing on a thought. That was his habit when he did not want to feel something. A young woman in her mid-20s, bruised and barefoot, breathing like she had run straight out of hell itself. No wagon, no supplies, no story that ended well. His eyes stayed on her too long. That was his bad habit. He looked at people like they were puzzles. He could read a man across a poker table better than most, but he never learned when to stop staring. The girl noticed. Her hands trembled harder. Panic rose in her throat like bile. She had seen that look before. The pause before a man decided what he could take from her. She pulled the cloth tighter around her shoulders, pressed her back hard into the bark of the tree, and forced the words out through cracked lips. Do not look at me like that. The sentence cracked between them, sharp and fragile at the same time. Caleb flinched like she had struck him across the face. He looked down at his hands, suddenly aware of himself. aware of how that silence must feel to someone already broken. Slowly, carefully, he swung down from the saddle. He kept both hands where she could see them. He moved like a man approaching a wounded animal, knowing any sudden movement would send her running again. "I am not here to hurt you," he said it low and calm, like a man talking to a spooked horse. He took off his coat, laid it on the ground several steps away from her, then backed off again. He turned his head to the side, giving her privacy without making a show of it. Use it. He kept his eyes fixed on the fence line instead of on her. Only when the coat disappeared around her shoulders did he let himself breathe again. She did not move for a long moment. Then slowly she reached for the coat like it might vanish if she touched it too fast. Her eyes stayed locked on him, wide and glassy, waiting for the lie to show itself, waiting for the trick. Caleb noticed the marks then, the bruises that were not from falling, the kind that came from hands grabbing too hard, the kind that came from a man, not from the trail, the way she flinched when even the wind touched her skin. He did not ask questions. Questions could wait. Fear could not. You are safe here. For now. He meant it, but he also knew how cheap those words sounded. Safety was a promise the West rarely kept. As he crouched down to pour water from his canteen into a tin cup, the sleeve of his shirt slid back for half a second. Sunlight caught the pale ring of skin on his finger, a mark where a wedding band used to sit. He noticed it too late. She saw it. Her eyes flicked from the mark to his face, and something else broke inside her. A man who looked that long. A man who said gentle things. A man who had a wife somewhere. Caleb followed her gaze and his jaw clenched hard. He pulled his hand away and rubbed the mark like it burned him. He said nothing. Silence was his habit, and it had ruined things before. Out here on the frontier, a man's best habit could turn into his worst flaw. Caleb Hart was living proof of that truth. The girl finally took the cup. Her fingers brushed his for just a moment, then snapped back like she had touched fire. She drank too fast, choked on the water, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and stared at the dirt beneath her feet. "I cannot go back." Caleb did not ask where back was. He already knew it was not a place that deserved her. From the far road behind them, a faint sound carried on the hot wind, the rhythm of hooves where no one should be riding this time of day. Coming closer, coming steady. Caleb stood slowly, his eyes narrowed as he listened. The past he had buried, the wife people whispered about, the trouble now standing at the edge of his land. He had a choice to make, and whatever he decided, it would not leave his hands clean. That night, Caleb did not sleep. He sat on the edge of his porch with a tin cup of coffee gone cold, listening to the dark breathe around his land. The girl slept in the hayloft of his barn, wrapped in his coat, finally still after hours of shaking. Every few minutes she would twitch in her sleep like she was falling again. And every time she did, Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, something that had nothing to do with fear. By dawn, he knew two things for certain. Someone was looking for her, and whoever they were not coming with good intentions. The hooves he had heard yesterday would come back. Men like that always came back. And when they did, Caleb would have to make another choice. Protect her and bring trouble to his door, or turn away and let her face that trouble alone. He had spent most of his life choosing the safe path, keeping his head down, minding his own business, letting other people's problems stay other people's problems. But something about the way she had said those words kept echoing in his skull. "Do not look at me like that." She had been scared of him, scared of a man who only wanted to help, because every other man who had looked at her that way had wanted something else entirely. Caleb rubbed the pale mark on his finger where his wedding ring used to sit. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about all the words he never said, all the times he chose silence when he should have spoken. And he made his decision. Whatever was coming for this girl would have to go through him first. He did not know yet that this choice would cost him everything he had built. He did not know that the man hunting her was one of the most powerful men in the territory. He did not know that by sunrise tomorrow, his name would be dragged through mud and his reputation destroyed. But even if he had known all of that, I think he would have made the same choice. Because some debts cannot be paid with money. Some wrongs cannot be fixed with silence. And some men do not become who they are meant to be until they stop running from trouble and start running toward it. This is where our story truly begins. She found him sitting up just after sunrise. Her knees were pulled to her chest and she stared at the slats of light cutting through the wooden boards of the barn. She looked worn in the morning light, like the night had taken whatever strength she had left. Caleb climbed the ladder slow, letting his boots make noise so she would hear him coming. He did not want to spook her again. "My name is Leah May Jean." She said it before he could ask anything. Her voice was rough but steady, like she had practiced saying the words out loud to herself. "I taught school for a spell down in Tascosa. I am not a child, even if I look like one right now. I did not plan on ending up here." Caleb nodded once. Most folks do not plan on ending up anywhere. Life just happens and we deal with it best we can. It was not a joke, but it was not a sermon either. Just the truth spoken plain. She told him enough to matter, not enough to bleed. She had been staying with family outside Tascosa. Her older sister, Martha, had married a man named Silas Clean 4 years back. When their parents died of fever, Leah had nowhere else to go. So she moved in with them, helped around the house, taught at the local school. Silas Clean was a man folks tipped their hats to, a man they trusted with cattle and money and important decisions. He sat on the church board. He shook hands with politicians when they came through town. He smiled at everyone, and everyone smiled back. Leah stopped there for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the wooden floor of the loft. He said no one would believe me. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I believed him. For 2 whole years, I believed him. Caleb did not push. He did not need details to hear the truth in her voice. He had lived long enough to recognize the sound of someone who had run because staying meant breaking into pieces. What surprised him was what came next. She had not just run with fear. She had run with something Silas wanted back. From inside the folded cloth she had carried all this way, she pulled out a thin ledger page, creased and smudged, numbers written careful and tight in neat rows. "I do not know what all these numbers mean." She held it out to him with shaking hands. "But he nearly killed me trying to get it back." Caleb took the page and read it once. Then he read it again. Then he went quiet in that way that made people uneasy. It was not a love letter. It was not a confession. It was worse. Weights that did not match up. Dates that skipped around wrong. Marks that did not belong to honest ranch work. Cattle that vanished on paper and reappeared somewhere else with different brands. Money flowing in directions it should not flow. This was not just cruelty. This was crime. The kind that powerful men committed because they believed no one would ever catch them. "You did not steal this." Caleb said it as fact, not question. She shook her head fast. "I found it." He hid it under the floor in his office. "I thought if I kept it, maybe I could make him stop. Maybe I could protect myself." Caleb sighed through his nose. He folded the paper careful and tucked it inside his shirt. That was the trouble with truth in the wrong hands. It did not protect you. It painted a target on your back. He was about to say something else when the sound came again. Hooves on the road, closer this time than yesterday. Caleb moved to the edge of the loft and looked out through a crack in the boards. 2 riders coming up slow, their eyes scanning his ranch like they already owned it. "Stay here. Stay quiet. Do not come down until I come get you." Leah nodded, pressing herself back into the shadows. Caleb climbed down the ladder and walked out to meet whatever was coming. The 2 men stopped their horses at the fence line. One of them smiled like a preacher about to save your soul. The other one did not smile at all. His hand rested too close to his belt. "Morning, friend." The smiling one tipped his hat. "We are looking for a young woman. Might have passed through this way. Brown hair, skinny thing. Probably looks scared." Caleb leaned his weight against the fence post. His face gave nothing away. "Plenty of folks pass through this stretch. Most do not stay long." The men exchanged a look. The quiet one glanced toward the barn. That was enough to tell Caleb everything he needed to know. "You seen her or not?" The smiling one's voice had changed. Harder now, less friendly. Caleb straightened up. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. That made it worse somehow. "You should ride on now." The smile faded from the first man's face. The quiet one reached for his reins wrong, his hand moving too slow and too deliberate. Caleb moved before the thought finished forming in his head. It was not a fair fight. It was not meant to be. A hard shove sent the smiling one into the dust. A fist connected with the quiet one's ribs before he could draw. A boot came down near his hand, missing his fingers by inches but sending a message clear as day. They backed off fast after that, cursing and spitting and promising trouble. The smiling one wiped blood from his lip and said a name out loud, said it like it carried weight. Silas Clean will not like this. You just made yourself a powerful enemy, friend. Caleb watched them ride off. His heart pounded slow and heavy in his chest. He had crossed a line now. He knew it. Back in the barn, Leia stood frozen at the bottom of the ladder. She was clutching the rail so hard her knuckles had gone white. You did not have to do that. Her voice was barely a whisper. Yeah, I did. That was the moment Caleb stopped pretending this was about charity. This was about a choice he had made a long time ago, back when he watched wrong people walk free because nobody wanted the trouble. I am not handing you back to him. Caleb looked her in the eye when he said it. But I am not hiding you forever either. That is no kind of life. She swallowed hard. Then what happens to me? Caleb rubbed his jaw, thinking. He hated towns, hated courts, hated the way words got twisted once they left your mouth. But he hated bullies more. We take this to the law, careful and quiet. We find someone who is not in Silas Clean's pocket, someone who will look at those numbers and see what they mean. Her shoulders slumped. Relief and dread mixed together on her face. People will talk. They already think things about you, about me, about why I am here. Caleb looked away toward the empty horizon. He thought about the ring mark on his hand, about the wife folks whispered about how easy it was for a story to outrun the truth. Let them think what they want. Truth catches up eventually. He said it like he believed it, and maybe part of him did, but another part of him knew better. Truth was slow, lies were fast, and by the time truth finally caught up, a whole lot of damage could already be done. As the sun climbed higher, Caleb saddled his horse with the slow certainty of a man walking into a fight he could not avoid. He did not know yet that Silas had already been to town, that words had already been planted like seeds of poison, that by the time they reached Amarillo, the story waiting for them would paint him as the villain and her as the liar. If the law believed Silas first, would anyone listen to a rancher with a past and a girl with nothing left to lose? Caleb chose Amarillo because it sat between nowhere and everywhere. Not too small to be blind to corruption, not big enough to be owned by one man. At least that was what he hoped. They rode at a steady pace through the morning heat, not fast enough to draw notice, not slow enough to invite questions. Leia kept her head down, riding close behind him on the spare horse. His old coat was still pulled tight around her shoulders even in the warmth. She did not speak much. Neither did he. Some roads were better traveled without talk. By mid-morning, the town came into view. Low buildings crouched under the sun like they were tired of standing. Dust hung in the air like a second sky, coating everything in a layer of brown. Caleb felt the shift the moment they crossed the first hitching post. Eyes lifted from porches. Men paused their conversations. A woman pulled her child closer as they passed. Stories were already here, waiting for them, and Silas did not have to ride fast. He just had to send a man ahead with a lie. And lies traveled quicker than horses ever could. They went to the edge of town first, where a small postal office leaned against a feed store. Caleb knew the deputy there by sight, not by name. That was usually enough. The deputy listened with his arms crossed over his chest. His face was set in that careful way men wore when they did not want trouble to stick to them. Leia spoke soft and slow. Her hands were folded tight in her lap. She said only what she had to say. The names, the dates, the bruises she could show, and the ones she could not. Caleb stood silent beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes watching every twitch of the man across the desk. The deputy nodded slow. He asked a few questions. Then he asked a few more that cut sideways, circling around to the same point from different angles. He was not just asking, he was testing. Caleb could see it in the man's eyes, the way a ranch dog circles a stranger before deciding whether to bite or bark. The deputy asked the same question 3 different ways, and every time he did, Leia's fingers tightened in her lap until her knuckles went white. Caleb wanted to step in, wanted to say the words that would set things straight, but his mouth stayed shut. His habit held him prisoner. He hated himself for it, because he knew exactly what the deputy was thinking. A scared young woman and a quiet older man with a mark on his finger where a wedding ring used to be. That story never ended gentle. Where did she come from? Why was she with him? Why had she run? How did they know each other? Caleb answered when it mattered. He did not answer when it did not. He thought holding his tongue was keeping control of the situation. He was wrong. Silence worked in poker. Silence worked on the open range. But here in town, swallowed words sounded exactly like guilt. By the time they stepped back into the street, Caleb knew they had not been believed. Not fully. Not enough. The deputy had taken her name down. He had taken Caleb's name too. And he had taken a long look at Caleb's hand when he reached for the door handle on the way out. The pale ring mark did not lie. It just did not tell the whole truth either. Leah saw it too. She did not say anything, but her shoulders stiffened. The space between them grew careful again, like it had been that first morning. They had not gone 3 blocks when Caleb spotted the men watching from the shade of the livery stable. One of them smiled when their eyes met. Caleb recognized that kind of smile. It said the game was already rigged. It said the story had already been told and believed. He turned Leah down a side street, but it did not matter. By noon, word had spread to the center of town. Tascosa was only a day's ride away, but its influence reached much farther than that. Silas Clean had friends in Amarillo, more friends than Caleb had expected. The sheriff arrived in the afternoon. He rode in slow and easy, like a man who belonged everywhere he stopped. He greeted Caleb like an old acquaintance, even though they had never met. He greeted Leah like a problem that needed solving. The talk was polite, too polite. The sheriff said Silas was worried sick about his sister-in-law, said family matters should be handled by family, said a young woman in distress sometimes said things she later regretted, said maybe everyone should take a breath and think about this carefully. Caleb felt the old anger stir deep in his gut, the kind he kept buried because letting it out never helped anything. He answered carefully. He watched the sheriff the way he watched weather rolling in, looking for the signs of what was really coming. But watching was not enough. The sheriff's eyes dropped to Caleb's hand, then they moved to Leah, then back to Caleb. He said the words slow, like they carried all the weight in the world. "You are a married man, Mr. Hart. That is what folks say." Caleb felt his jaw clamp shut. He made the same mistake again. Went still instead of speaking. Stillness had kept him alive on the trail for 30 years, but here it made him look like a liar caught in the act. The street felt quieter all at once, like everyone was holding their breath. Caleb did not deny it. Denial would have sounded worse. He only said the truth was longer than one sentence could hold. The sheriff nodded like a man who had already made up his mind before he asked the question. "Well now, until things get sorted out proper, I think the young lady would be better off with her kin. For her own protection, of course." 2 men stepped forward from behind the sheriff, the same faces from the livery stable, the same smiles. Leah took a step backward. Her hand brushed against Caleb's sleeve. Just once, just for a second. Caleb wanted to stop it, wanted to put himself between her and those men, wanted to tell the sheriff exactly how wrong he was about everything. But words were slippery here, and fists would only seal her fate. They would call him violent, call him dangerous, call him exactly what Silas wanted them to call him. So he stood there, frozen by his own silence, trapped by his own habits. They took her then, not rough, not gentle, just firm enough to make clear that the law was on their side. Leah looked back at him one time as they walked her toward a waiting wagon. Her eyes were not angry. They were not even scared anymore. They were disappointed, like she had expected this all along, like she had known no one would fight for her when it mattered. Caleb stood in the middle of that dusty street and watched them take her away. It was the hardest thing he had done in years. That night, Amarillo felt smaller than any stretch of open land Caleb had ever crossed. He sat alone outside the boarding house, listening to laughter drift from somewhere he did not belong. Fiddle music played in a saloon down the street. People lived their lives like nothing was wrong. Because for them, nothing was wrong. This was not their fight. Caleb thought about the ledger page still folded in his pocket, the names and marks that did not line up, the way Silas had sent other men to do his dirty work instead of coming himself. That told Caleb something important. Silas was powerful, but he was also careful. Careful men did not get their own hands dirty. Careful men built walls of respectability around themselves. But careful men also made mistakes because they got comfortable, because they believed they were untouchable. That was when Caleb made his second choice of the day. He would not fight Silas in Amarillo where the game was rigged. He would take this fight somewhere else, somewhere the name Silas Clean did not carry so much weight. Before dawn, Caleb saddled his horse and rode north, past the town, past the places where gossip lived, toward Fort Elliott, where men wore badges that did not bend for local names, where federal marshals handled crimes that crossed boundaries. Stolen cattle crossed jurisdictions. So did men who thought they were untouchable. The marshal at Fort Elliott listened longer than the deputy in Amarillo had, not because he was kinder, but because the ledger page made sense to him. Numbers were his language. Patterns were his profession. He studied the page for a long time. Then he looked up at Caleb with eyes that had seen plenty of liars and learned to recognize truth. If Silas Clean is dirty, I will find out. He did not promise justice. He only promised attention. Out here, attention from the right man was worth more than promises anyway. Caleb left Fort Elliott without comfort, but with direction. Behind him, Leah was already being moved again. Farther from town, farther from help. And Silas was probably smiling right now, believing the worst was over. But the law had finally taken notice. And when it came looking, it would not come quiet. The only question now was simple and cruel. Would it come in time? Caleb rode hard from Fort Elliott, not reckless, just determined in that quiet way men get when they know they are late, but keep moving anyway. The marshal had not promised him justice. He had promised attention. And out here on the frontier, attention from the right man mattered more than empty words from 100 wrong ones. The trail south ran dry and pale under the afternoon sun, the kind of trail that showed every mistake a horse could make. Caleb read it without thinking. After 30 years of tracking cattle across this land, reading ground was as natural as breathing. He could tell where a rider had slowed down to rest, where one had looked back over his shoulder, where another had been dragged forward by fear instead of plan. They were moving Leah, not hiding her, moving her. That told him more than anything else could have. Men who believed they were safe did not rush. Men who believed the law was sleeping did not change their routes. The fact that Silas was moving her meant he was nervous now, and nervous men made errors. By late afternoon, Caleb found the first sign, a scrap of cloth caught on a mesquite thorn, pale against the red dirt. Not hers exactly, but close enough to know he was on the right trail. He did not call out, did not hurry. He followed the trail the way he had followed cattle for 3 decades. Patient, exact, letting the land tell its story. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the wind shifted direction. It carried sound now, voices, a horse snorting, metal touching metal like a gun being checked. Caleb slowed his horse to a stop. He slid down from the saddle, quiet as shadow, and led his horse the last stretch on foot. Up ahead, near a shallow bend in the Canadian River, 3 men waited. One paced back and forth, kicking at rocks. One leaned against a cottonwood tree with his arms crossed. One sat his horse too still, watching the trail like he expected trouble. Leah was there too. She was not tied. That was the cruel part. She did not need rope. Fear was doing the work rope would have done. Then Silas Clean stepped into view. He looked exactly like the kind of man people trusted. Clean shirt even out here in the dust. Calm face. The same expression he probably wore in church on Sundays. He spoke to Leah like he was doing her a favor by not hurting her worse. Caleb watched from the brush and felt his jaw lock so tight his teeth ached. This was the man people respected. This was the man they tipped their hats to and trusted with important decisions. This was the man who smiled while deciding exactly how much pain someone else would suffer. Caleb could have shot him right then. The thought crossed his mind, clear and simple. One pull of the trigger, end of everything. But he heard the marshal's voice in his head again. If you act first, the truth never gets heard. They will call you the murderer instead of him. So Caleb waited. The waiting cost him. He watched Silas strike one of his own men for some small mistake. A sharp backhand across the face, quick and mean, the kind of blow a man throws when he is used to hitting people smaller than himself. Leah flinched so hard she stumbled backward. That was enough. Caleb stepped out of the brush into the open. His hands hung low at his sides. His voice came out steady as stone. Let her go, the three men spun around, reaching for weapons. Silas just smiled like he had been expecting this moment all day. Well now, you really should learn to mind your own land, Mr. Hart. People in town are already talking about you, saying all kinds of interesting things. Caleb said nothing. The old silence settled over him again, his worst habit holding him hostage at the worst possible moment. One of the men reached for his gun wrong, too slow, too obvious. Caleb moved right. What happened next was not pretty, it was not brave, it was not the kind of fight they tell stories about around campfires. It was fast and close and ugly in the way real fights always are when men are tired and scared and fighting for something that matters. A hard shove sent one man stumbling into the shallow water of the river. A fist landed solid against another jaw. A gun got kicked away before it could clear leather. Boot heels scraped against rock and dirt. When it was over, two men were down and groaning. The third had run for his horse. Silas had backed up against a tree. His calm face was cracking now, the mask slipping. You think this helps her? His voice had gone thin and sharp. You think anyone will believe you over me? I am Silas Clean. You are nobody. Caleb stood between Silas and Leia. He did not look back at her, just kept his body between her and the threat. That was the choice, clear as daylight. Then the sound of hooves came again. More than one horse. More than two. Silas froze. Just for a second. Just long enough for Caleb to see the fear flash across his eyes. The marshal rode in with two deputies behind him. Dust rolled up behind them like a curtain being pulled back on a stage. No shouting, no dramatic speeches. Just authority arriving late, but arriving heavy. The marshal looked at Silas the way a man looks at cattle he is counting. Calm, professional, already calculating. You boys are a long way from home. Silas laughed once, short and sharp and nervous. This is a family matter, Marshal. Nothing that concerns federal law. The marshal swung down from his saddle. Stolen cattle cross state lines. That makes it federal business. Falsified brands cross jurisdictions. That makes it my business. And when a man sends armed riders to silence a witness, well, that makes it real personal. Silas's eyes flicked to Caleb's hand, to the ring mark, to the rumor he thought would still protect him. This man is not what he seems. He has a wife somewhere. He took this girl under suspicious circumstances. Ask anyone in Amarillo what they think of him. The marshal did not even blink. I am not asking Amarillo anything. I am asking the numbers. And numbers do not lie the way people do. They took Silas then, not gently, not roughly, just the way men get taken when the game is finally up and they know it. Leia stood shaking by the riverbank. She stared at the water like she could still disappear into it if she needed to. Caleb said her name once. Soft. She looked at him and she nodded. Just once. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something. The ride back to Fort Elliott was quiet. No relief yet. Only space to feel the weight of what had almost gone wrong. At the fort, the marshal did not thank Caleb. He did not need to. He just said the case would move forward now. Slow and thorough. That was how the law worked when it decided to work at all. As Leia was led inside to give her official statement, she stopped at the door and turned back. You did not have to do any of this. Caleb shrugged. The movement was stiff, like his shoulders had forgotten how to relax. Somebody should have. A long time ago. The marshal watched him for a long moment after she disappeared inside. People say you have got a wife somewhere. Caleb did not answer right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the door Leia had walked through. Then he nodded once. I did. Maybe I still do. I do not know anymore. That complicates things, the marshal said. Everything does, Caleb replied. He knew his flaws better than anyone else ever could. The staring, the silence, the pride that kept him from asking questions he should have asked years ago. A man could outrun trouble for decades until his own habits finally caught up with him. Night fell over Fort Elliott, cooler than the land beyond it. Caleb sat alone on a bench outside the main building, thinking about all the years he had let settle without examination. About the woman everyone said he still belonged to. About the girl inside who needed more than just protection now. He had stood up against violence. He had stood up against corrupt law. But the hardest thing was still ahead of him, because when the full truth finally came out, it would not just destroy Silas clean. It would dig up a past Caleb had never properly laid to rest. The days that followed moved slower than Caleb expected, and heavier than he liked. That was the way the law worked when it actually decided to work. Slow steps, careful questions, men writing things down instead of raising their voices. The marshal was methodical in a way that drove Caleb half crazy with waiting. But waiting was all he could do now. Leia stayed near the fort in a small room that smelled of soap and old wood. She answered questions when she could. She stared out the window when she could not. Some days the words came easy, other days she could barely speak at all. Caleb waited outside more than once, hat in his hands, feeling older than he had felt in 20 years. The marshal kept his word about the investigation. He did not rush, he followed the paper trail. Paper sounds boring until you realize paper is how powerful men steal without ever firing a shot. A false brand on a calf is one thing. A false number on a ledger page can steal a whole ranch out from under a man. Caleb watched the marshal lay the evidence out on his desk and tap the same names again and again. Each time his finger landed, Caleb felt the net tightening around Silas clean. But Silas was not just cruel, he was careful. And careful men do not get caught unless somebody makes them angry enough to slip. Unless someone close enough to see the truth decides to speak it. Within a week, names started to repeat in the investigation. Dates overlapped in ways that did not make sense for honest business. Brands showed up in the wrong places at the wrong times. Silas Clean stopped smiling. They brought him in for questioning twice. The first time he laughed it off, cracked jokes with the deputies, acted like the whole thing was a misunderstanding that would sort itself out soon. The second time, he asked for a lawyer. That told Caleb everything he needed to know. But the law was not finished with its questions, and neither was Silas finished with his tricks. One night, a fire broke out at a holding pen near the river. Evidence that might have helped the case turned to ash. Another night, a witness who had agreed to talk packed his bags and left town before sunrise. Nobody knew where he went. The marshal started sleeping with his boots on, ready to ride at a moment's notice. So did Caleb. Leia noticed the tension. She noticed everything now. Fear had sharpened her senses until they cut like a blade. "I do not want this trouble to follow you forever," she said it one evening as they sat on a bench outside the fort. The air had cooled and the sky had turned that deep purple color that only happened in Texas at sunset. Caleb looked out toward the darkness gathering on the horizon. "It already has been following me longer than you know." She studied him then, the same way he used to study other people. Quiet, careful, like she was reading words written in a language most folks could not see. "They keep saying you have a wife." Caleb did not answer right away. When he did, his voice was flat as the land around them. "I did. I think maybe I still do. Legally, anyway." That was when the past stopped being a rumor and started being a problem that had to be dealt with. Her name was Evelyn. They had married young and stubborn, back when promises felt like armor that could protect you from anything. Caleb was 23. She was 21. They built a life out of hope and hard work and the kind of love that burns hot at the start. Then sickness came through the territory like a shadow. Work dried up, the land turned mean, and Evelyn left with a wagon heading east, chasing help and hope, and something Caleb could not give her. The letter saying she had arrived safely never came. The letter saying she was coming back never came either. So people filled in the silence with their own stories. And I let them, Caleb said, because answering questions hurt worse than silence. The marshal had listened to that whole story with the same patience he gave to numbers and brands. Then he leaned back in his chair and said something Caleb had not expected. "We may need her to close this case proper." Caleb felt his stomach drop like a stone. Silas had been careful, and too careful. But there were gaps in his careful planning that only someone close would know about. Routes he had used years ago when he was just starting his operation. Names he had trusted back when he was not so powerful. If Evelyn was still alive somewhere, she might be the missing piece. She had lived in that area when Silas was building his empire of stolen cattle and false brands. She might have seen things, heard things, known things. They found her 6 days later, not far from Fort Elliott at all, working in a boarding house near a rail spur where the trains kept moving through day and night. The marshal had asked around the rail lines because people who wanted to disappear often ended up where the trains never stopped. Older now, thinner, hair gone gray at the temples, but still standing. When Caleb saw her for the first time in 12 years, he did not feel relief. He felt weight. All the weight of all the words he never said pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. Evelyn looked at him with eyes that held no softness, no warmth, no happy reunion. You never came looking. She said it like a fact, not an accusation, just the truth spoken plain. Caleb held his tongue. Because she was not wrong, she looked at him for a long moment, like she had been rehearsing this conversation in her head for years, and now that it was finally happening, the words did not fit quite right. I heard you were still out here, still on that land. Caleb nodded. I heard you had trouble, something about a girl. He nodded again. They talked slow after that. No shouting, no tears, just facts that had been left too long in the dark finally coming into the light. Evelyn had gotten sick on the journey east, nearly died. By the time she recovered, she had convinced herself Caleb did not want her back, that his silence meant he had moved on. That writing would only make things worse. So she built a new life, small and quiet, working jobs that paid enough to live on, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Why did you never write to me? She asked. Even once. Caleb's jaw worked like he was chewing on glass. Because I was scared of what your answer might be. Scared you left because I was not enough. Scared that if I asked and you said no, I would not survive it. It was the most honest thing he had said in 12 years. Evelyn looked at him with something that might have been pity or understanding, or maybe just exhaustion. We wasted a lot of years being scared of each other. The marshal cleared his throat from the doorway. I hate to interrupt, but I need to ask you some questions, ma'am, about Silas Clean and some things that happened around Tascosa about 10 years back. Evelyn's expression changed then. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. Her eyes went hard. I know that name. I know exactly what kind of man he is. She did not testify for Caleb. She made that clear from the start. She did not care about settling old debts or rekindling old flames. She testified because she was tired of watching men like Silas walk around clean while everyone they hurt paid the price. She told the marshal about a night years ago when she had seen Silas meeting men by the river, trading papers and coin like it was nothing. She had not known what it meant at the time, but she remembered the faces, the dates, the brands on the cattle that changed overnight. It was enough. When she finished giving her statement, she did not stay for coffee or comfort. She walked back out to her life, and Caleb did not try to follow her. Some doors close for good reason. Trying to force them open only breaks what is left. But before she left, she stopped at the door and looked back at him one more time. That girl in there, the one everyone keeps talking about. Caleb waited. She looks at you like you might actually be worth something. Do not waste that. Not like we wasted us. Then she was gone. The case turned after that, quietly, decisively. They brought Silas in again, this time without smiles or speeches. The marshal laid out the evidence piece by piece, like a man setting tools on a workbench. Each piece fit into the next. Each number matched a crime. Each name connected to another name until the whole rotten web was visible. Silas watched it happen with eyes that kept searching for a door that was no longer there. When they took him away for good, even the men who used to tip their hats to him would not meet his eyes. The town just exhaled. That was how it usually went with powerful men who finally fell. Not with a bang, just with a long, slow breath of relief from everyone who had been holding it in. Caleb should have known it was not over yet. Men like Silas Clean did not go down quiet. They did not accept defeat gracefully. They clawed and scratched and bit until the very last moment, dragging down as many people as they could reach. The night after Silas was formally charged, Caleb was walking back to the boarding house where he had been staying near Fort Elliott. The streets were dark and quiet. Most folks had already turned in for the night. A man Caleb did not recognize was waiting by the wagon route, acting like he belonged there, leaning against a post with his hat pulled low. Something about him was wrong, a little too still, a little too ready. Caleb spotted the danger the way he had always spotted trouble on the trail. That prickle at the back of his neck. That tightness in his gut that said, move now and think later. The man stepped out of the shadows. His hand drifted toward his coat. Mr. Clean sends his regards. Says to tell you this ain't finished just because he is locked up. Caleb did not wait for the speech to end. He moved before the man could finish reaching for whatever was hidden under that coat. It was not a shootout. It was not dramatic. Just a hard shove that sent the stranger stumbling into the dirt. A wrist twisted until something popped. A knee pressed into the man's back until he stopped struggling. When the deputies arrived a few minutes later, the whole story came spilling out. Silas had paid this man to do two things. First, scare Leah into keeping quiet. Make sure she understood that even with Silas behind bars, she was not safe. Second, make Caleb look like the problem. Start a fight, get Caleb to throw the first punch. Then claim self-defense and watch Caleb get arrested for assault. The marshal heard all of this, and the last bit of protection Silas thought he had disappeared like smoke. Witness tampering, conspiracy, attempted intimidation. The charges kept piling up. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Silas Clean was facing enough charges to keep him locked away for the rest of his natural life. No amount of money or influence or carefully cultivated reputation could save him now. Leah found Caleb sitting alone on the porch of the marshal's office. The morning light was soft and golden. Birds were starting to sing somewhere in the distance. She sat down beside him without asking permission. Is it really over? Caleb thought about the question for a long moment before answering. The part with Silas is over. The law will handle the rest. Slow but sure. She nodded, but her eyes stayed troubled. What about us? What happens now? Caleb looked at his hands, at the pale mark where his wedding ring used to sit, the mark that had caused so much trouble, the mark that had made everyone assume the worst about him. I do not know, he said honestly. I spent so many years just surviving that I forgot how to think about what comes next. Leah was quiet for a while. When she spoke again, her voice was steady. I used to think being strong meant not needing anyone, handling everything on my own, never asking for help because asking meant you were weak. She turned to look at him directly. Now I think being strong means something different. It means choosing who you trust and sticking with that choice even when it gets hard. Caleb met her eyes. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he did not look away. I am not good at words, never have been. My silence has cost me more than I can count. Cost me my marriage. Cost me years of loneliness. Almost cost you your chance at justice. He took a breath. But if you are willing to be patient with a stubborn old man who is still learning how to speak up, I would like to try being better. Leah smiled. Just a little. Just enough. I am not expecting perfect. I am just expecting honest. That is something I can do. They sat there together as the sun climbed higher, not touching, not making promises, just being present in the same space at the same time. It was not a fairy tale ending. Real life rarely handed those out, but it was a beginning. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and paperwork. Caleb testified about what he had seen and heard. Leah testified about what she had survived. Witness after witness came forward now that Silas was behind bars and could not hurt them anymore. The truth has a way of spreading once fear stops holding it back. Silas tried every trick in the book, claimed the evidence was fabricated, claimed Caleb had a grudge against him, claimed Leah was lying for attention. None of it worked. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Guilty on all counts. When the judge read out the sentence, Silas finally looked his age. All the charm drained out of his face. All the confidence collapsed. He was just an old man who had spent his whole life hurting people and finally got caught. Caleb watched him get led away in chains and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just a tired kind of relief. It is done, Leah said quietly beside him. He nodded. What Silas did to you, what he did to all those people, it is done. But Caleb knew better than to think that was the end of everything. The law had done its part. The bad man was locked away. Justice had been served. But justice does not heal wounds. It just stops new ones from being made. The real work was still ahead of them both. They left Fort Elliott on a Tuesday morning when the sky was clear and the wind had finally stopped blowing dust into everything. Caleb had not been back to his ranch in almost 3 weeks. Longest he had been away since he first built the place with his own 2 hands 20 years ago. He wondered what shape it would be in, whether the fences had held, whether anything had gotten into the chicken coop, whether the whole place had just given up and collapsed without him there to hold it together. Leah rode beside him on the spare horse. She had gotten better at riding over the past weeks, more comfortable in the saddle, less tense. She was healing, slow but steady. The bruises had faded. The fear in her eyes had dimmed to something more like caution. She would never be the same person she was before Silas. Nobody came through something like that unchanged, but she was still standing, still moving forward. That counted for something. They reached the ranch by late afternoon. The fences had held. The cabin was still standing. The animals had been looked after by a neighbor Caleb had asked to check in on things. It was strange walking back into a place that used to feel so empty and realizing it might not have to stay that way. Leah stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked around at the simple furniture. The worn wooden table, the fireplace blackened by years of use, the shelf of books that Caleb had collected one at a time from passing traders. "You built all this yourself?" "Most of it. Took me about 2 years to get it where I wanted." She ran her hand along the back of a chair. "It feels like you." Caleb was not sure if that was a compliment or not. He decided not to ask. The first few days back were awkward. Neither of them quite knew how to share space with another person. Caleb was used to silence and solitude. Leah was used to watching her back every moment. They moved around each other like dancers learning new steps, careful not to bump into each other, careful not to assume too much. But slowly, they found a rhythm. Leah helped with the books. She had taught school, after all. Numbers and letters came easy to her. She found mistakes in Caleb's record-keeping that he had been making for years without noticing. Caleb taught her how to read the land, how to spot a storm coming 2 hours before it arrived, how to tell if a fence post was going to hold or needed replacing, how to move through the world paying attention instead of just passing through. They talked more than Caleb had talked to anyone in years. Not big conversations at first, just small things. What they wanted for supper, whether the creek was running high or low, when the general store in town got its next shipment. But small talk builds bridges, and bridges lead to bigger places. One evening about 2 weeks after they returned to the ranch, Leah asked him about Evelyn, not in an accusatory way, not demanding answers, just curious, trying to understand the man she was learning to trust. Caleb told her the whole story, from the beginning, the young love, the hard years, the sickness that drove them apart, the silence that kept them apart longer. "I was a coward," he said when he finished, "too scared to chase after her, too scared to write, too scared to find out the truth." Leah was quiet for a long moment. "You were hurt. Hurt people do not always think clearly. That is not an excuse, no. But it is an explanation. There is a difference." Caleb thought about that. She was right. Understanding why you made a mistake did not erase the mistake, but it helped you avoid making the same one again. "I do not want to be that man anymore," he said. "The one who goes quiet when things get hard. The one who lets fear make his decisions for him." And Leah reached across the table and put her hand on his. "Just for a moment. Just long enough to matter. Then show me. Every day. That is all any of us can do." Summer faded into fall. The days got shorter. The nights got cooler. The land started turning those golden colors that made Caleb remember why he had stayed here so long. Leah stayed too, not because she had nowhere else to go. By now she could have found work in any town in the territory. Her name had been cleared. Her reputation restored. The story of what she survived had spread far enough that people respected her now instead of pitying her. She stayed because she wanted to. That mattered more to Caleb than anything else. One morning he woke up before dawn and found her already sitting on the porch. She had a cup of coffee in her hands, and she was watching the stars fade as the sky turned pink at the edges. He sat down beside her without saying anything. They watched the sunrise together in comfortable silence. And Caleb realized something that made his chest ache in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. This was what he had been missing all those years. Not just a person to share his life with, but a person who could sit in silence with him and not need it filled. A person who understood that sometimes the best conversations are the ones where nobody says a word. He was falling in love with her, slow and steady, like the seasons changing, like the land healing after a hard winter. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not scared of what that meant. A full year passed before Caleb found the courage to say the words out loud. Not because he did not feel them sooner. He had known for months that what he felt for Leia was more than gratitude or companionship or the simple comfort of not being alone. But he wanted to be sure. Sure that she had healed enough to make her own choice freely. Sure that she was not staying out of obligation or fear of starting over somewhere new. Sure that when he asked the question, her answer would be truly hers. So he waited. He watched her grow stronger every time, watched her take on more responsibility around the ranch, watched her start smiling more easily, laughing at small things, looking at the world without flinching. He watched her build a life, not just survive one. And when he was finally certain that she was staying because she wanted to stay, he knew it was time. It was a cool evening in early autumn, the kind where the air smells like wood smoke and fallen leaves and the promise of change. They were sitting on the porch like they did most evenings now. Two chairs side by side, two cups of coffee growing cold, the stars just starting to appear. Caleb cleared his throat. Leia looked over at him. Something in his expression must have told her this was different from their usual quiet companionship. I am not good at speeches. She smiled a little. I know. And I am probably going to say this wrong because I have spent most of my life not saying things at all. She waited, patient, giving him the space to find his words. I never thought I would get another chance at this. After Evelyn left, I figured that was it for me. One try was all anyone got. I missed mine. End of story. He looked down at his hands, at the pale mark on his finger that had faded even more over the past year. But then you showed up at my fence line, scared and hurt and running from something terrible. And I made a choice to help you, not because I expected anything in return, just because it was the right thing to do. He took a breath. Somewhere along the way, helping you turned into something else. I do not know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe it was all at once. But I woke up one day and realized that this ranch does not feel like home anymore unless you are in it. Leia's eyes had gone soft. She was not smiling now, just listening with her whole self. I am not asking you to answer me tonight. I am not asking you to feel the same way. I just need you to know that if you want to stay here forever, there is a place for you. Not as a guest, not as someone I saved, as my partner, my equal, my wife if you will have me. The word hung in the air between them. Wife. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then Leia reached over and took his hand. She held it tight. Her fingers were warm against his calloused palm. You want to know something funny? Caleb shook his head slightly. He did not trust his voice. I have been waiting for you to say something for months. I was starting to think maybe you never would. That maybe your habit of staying quiet was going to win again. She squeezed his hand. I was so scared when I met you. Not just of what was behind me, but of everything that might be ahead. I thought I would never trust anyone again. Never feel safe again. Never believe that someone could look at me and see something worth keeping. Her voice caught a little. You changed that, not with big speeches or grand gestures, just by being steady, being patient, being there every single day, even when I was difficult, even when I pushed you away. She turned to face him fully. I do not need time to think about your question. I already know my answer. I have known it for a while now. Caleb felt his heart pounding so hard he was sure she could hear it. Yes, she said it simply, clearly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I will stay. Yes, I will build a life with you on this ranch until one of us is too old to sit on this porch anymore. Caleb exhaled. He had not realized he was holding his breath. He pulled her close and held her for a long time. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The stars came out fully overhead. The coffee went completely cold. And for the first time in his entire life, Caleb Hart understood what it felt like to be exactly where he was supposed to be. They got married 3 weeks later. Nothing fancy, just a handful of witnesses from the nearby town. A borrowed table set up under the cottonwood tree where they had first met. A preacher who kept the ceremony short because he could tell these two had already said everything that mattered. The vows were simple. I promise to speak up when it matters, Caleb said. Even when silence feels easier, I promise to fight for you and with you. I promise to be better today than I was yesterday. Leah smiled through tears. I promise to trust you, she said, even when trust is hard. I promise to stay even when leaving feels safer. I promise to remind you every day that you are worth more than your past mistakes. The preacher pronounced them married. The witnesses clapped. And that was that. No fireworks, no dramatic music. Just two imperfect people choosing each other and meaning it. Marriage did not fix everything. It was not supposed to. There were still hard days. Days when Caleb went quiet and Leah had to remind him to use his words. Days when old fears crept back and made her flinch at shadows. Some nights Caleb woke before dawn, restless in a way he could not explain. He would slip out to the porch and sit in the darkness, jaw working like he was chewing on thoughts he could not swallow. And Leah would find him there. She would not ask what was wrong. She would just wrap a blanket around her shoulders and sit down in the chair beside him. Staying, present, patient. That was their real marriage, not the ceremony under the cottonwood tree, not the vows they had spoken in front of witnesses. The real marriage was the choice they made every single day to stay, to show up, to try again even when it was hard. Caleb learned to talk more, slowly, imperfectly. Some days the words came easier than others, but he learned that speaking up, even when it felt wrong, was better than letting silence build walls between them. Leah learned to trust more, to believe that the safety she felt was real and not just temporary, to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. They built a life together, not the life either of them had imagined when they were young. Something different, something better in ways they could not have predicted. The ranch prospered. Leah's head for numbers turned out to be exactly what the operation needed. She found inefficiencies Caleb had accepted as normal. She negotiated better prices with buyers. She kept records so clean that even the most suspicious banker had nothing to complain about. Caleb kept doing what he had always done, working the land, tending the animals, fixing what broke and building what was needed. But now he did it alongside someone who cared whether he came home at the end of the day. 2 years after they married, they added a room to the cabin, then another one the year after that. Not for children. They had talked about it and decided they were both too old and too set in their ways to start raising babies. But there were always people passing through who needed help. Young men looking for honest work. Families heading west who needed a place to rest. Women running from the same kind of trouble Leah had escaped. The ranch became known as a place where people could find a meal and a roof and no questions asked. That felt right to both of them. You cannot save everyone, Leah said one night after a particularly difficult family had moved on. I know, Caleb replied, but you can save the ones in front of you, and that has to count for something. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It counts for everything. If you are still listening, let me tell you what I think this story means. Caleb Hart was not a hero. He was just a man who had spent most of his life staying quiet when he should have spoken. He let fear make his choices for him. He let silence become a wall instead of a comfort. But when the moment came that truly mattered, he chose differently. He could have turned away when he saw that scared girl by his fence. Could have told himself it was not his problem. Could have protected his peace and his reputation and let someone else deal with the mess. Instead, he stepped forward. Imperfect as he was, scared as he was, he made the choice that cost him everything comfortable and gained him everything worthwhile. Leah Mae Jean was not a helpless victim. She was a survivor who found the courage to run when running seemed impossible. She carried proof of a powerful man's crimes even knowing it might get her killed. She trusted a stranger when trust had only ever brought her pain. Together, they brought down a man who thought he was untouchable, not through violence or revenge, but through patience and truth and the steady refusal to give up. That is the lesson, I think. You do not have to be perfect to do the right thing. You do not have to have all the answers before you start asking questions. You do not have to be strong every moment of every day. You just have to choose, again and again. The hard right thing over the easy wrong one. Caleb and Leah lived out the rest of their years on that ranch. Not always happy, not always peaceful, but always together. Some nights, even in his old age, Caleb still woke before dawn, still sat on that porch with his jaw working, still wrestled with thoughts that would not leave him be. And Leia still found him there, still sat beside him, still stayed without being asked. That is what love looks like when the fairy tale ends and real life begins. Not perfect, not easy, just two people choosing each other over and over, even when the choosing is hard. If you made it this far, thank you for listening. Now I have one question for you before we part ways. Have you ever stayed quiet when you should have spoken? Have you ever let fear choose for you because choosing felt too hard? And if you could go back, knowing what you know now, would you still take the easy silence? Or would you finally say the words that needed saying? Think about that. And whatever you decide, I hope you choose brave.